All right, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right in the back? Okay, great. Welcome to the Military Museums. My name's Dave Peabody. I'm the manager here for those who don't know me, and I'm happy to welcome everyone back for another of our Highlanders lecture series in partnership with the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies with Dr. Hubert. So the University of Calgary and the Military Museums, located in the heart of southern Alberta, both acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So we've had, I think this is our third lecture for this fall with the center, and they've been great. And I'm really looking forward to this one. Being a reservist, I'm always very interested in procurement and how it works, which I'm sure is smoothly all the time. But it's great tonight, and Dr. Hubert will give more perspective on this, but somebody who's actually worked in this field and has a perspective on it that a lot of us aren't going to get, either serving in the military or just reading the media. There's a lot that goes on with this, and this should be a very interesting talk. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Hubert up to provide the proper introduction for our speaker tonight.
Okay, thank you. It's great to see everybody out. Again, I know that we have a speaker that you're going to be fascinated with. I mean, again, within our Highlander, we of course are quite proud of just bringing the very best minds together to discuss these important issues. And so therefore, we're very happy to be able to bring Dr. Ian Brodie forward. Before I say a few words about him in terms of his background and why you are going to be very impressed with what he has to say, I just wanted to also point out that the CMSS is also continuing to do our events, and here's the advertisements. If you like this, there's a couple of other events before the year even ends, and of course that's not even going into what's coming. But we have a film screening at the university campus on December 4th at 4 o'clock. The name of the film is One of Ours: The Story of Private Fred Lee. And posters are at the front where you can register. You also have the opportunity to meet with the director. He's flying in to give a talk and an introduction to the talk. So again, for anyone who is interested in seeing parts of our history, seeing how it is, of course, produced within film, I strongly recommend that you consider spending some time in coming out to that. And if for whatever reason, check with Mary if you just want to make sure that you need to register. Mary, of course, as I pointed out several times, knows everything, and she can help you in every direction. The second advertisement is that we, of course, have the next Highlander lecture will be by Dr. Maureen Hebert, who was the former director of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies. It will be here on January 30th, at 6 p.m., and her topic is going to be From Cylons to Captain America, the opportunities and challenges of military AI, lethal autonomous weapons, and enhanced soldiers. And I got to tell you, any talk that makes reference to Battlestar Galactica, you know it's going to be a winner. So Dr. Hebert has been quite in front of this subject for quite some time. So I do recommend that you put that into your calendar. The doors will open at 5:30. We're starting a little bit earlier for that talk, so just remember, normally we've been doors open at 6, start at 6:30. It's half an hour difference earlier, so just make sure. Okay, getting to our talker. Once again, we are privileged to have one of Canada's leading thinkers on this issue. This is Dr. Ian Brodie is one of those rare individuals. It's a little bit more of a common practice in the United States, where you both will get outstanding intellectuals from the university who then crisscross into the policy side. So you'll often see Many of the biggest names will, in fact, depending on what government is in power, you will see them actually serving within the government. Well, Dr. Brodie lives that experience. He's a bit of an exception within Canada. So beyond writing outstanding books on governance systems within Canada, within understanding how these work, he also served as the chief of staff for Stephen Harper. And so not only does he know the theory about how governments functions, but he has actually been at the front lines, and I dare say has actually informed parts of how the overall policies have developed. He's here to talk about a very important issue. I think all of us have seen in the newspapers that the current government is now being held accountable for its refusal to come to the 2% defense expenditure that was agreed upon back around 2014. There have been all sorts of concerns, particularly with the election of the new administration within the United States. And we are, in fact, seeing serious discussions about how we move forward. But Dr. Brodie is here to talk to us and educate us on one of what I would characterize as a pathology within the Canadian spending expenditure. How many of you actually, when you're thinking of buying a car, will sit down with your partner, with whomever you have to make the arrangements and say, okay, how many tires are we going to need? How much gas will we need for it? And how do we figure out what that is and utilize that as your base cost for costing? And of course, if you're like me, you're barely able to figure out what the tax at GST is going to be on, let alone what you're going to be paying for gas for the life of the experience. And so Dr. Brodie is here to explain to us how this process works. And I, for one, I'm very much looking forward. We'll follow the normal procedure. He will talk for anywhere between half an hour to an hour, in which case we will then open it up for questions within the formal session, to be followed, of course, when he gets a chance to have a beer, and then he can ask some informal questions after that. So without further ado, we are very privileged to hear from Dr. Ian Brodie.
Well, thank you, Rob, for that very kind introduction. I thought it was a bit over the top, but frankly, I'll take it. As I said, in government, I'm happy to take credit for things I didn't do, because I will constantly be blamed for things I didn't do. It all ends up in the end. I'm also happy to have this opportunity courtesy of the Highlanders Fund, not just because as a Brodie, of course, I identify with Highlanders of all sorts, but because I recognize 115 years of service of the Highlanders and the 10th Battalion before them that have given to the country, and the service and sacrifice involved in that. I'm also grateful to the staff and volunteers at the museums here for lending us the venue. The museums are always my top recommendation for visitors to the city. I brought many friends and family through the halls and through the exhibits over the course of many, many years now. About 12 years ago, as a result of pressure from the Auditor General of Canada and the Parliamentary Budget Officer, they began to press the federal government to change the way that they expressed or projected the cost of new military equipment purchases, to adopt a new way of costing defense equipment purchases by moving the government towards what was called sometimes the full life or full life cycle assessment for the cost of a new piece of equipment. The idea at the time was to take the upfront cost of buying an airplane, a helicopter, a ship, what have you, and add to it the full cost of operating that equipment over its entire lifetime into one, frankly, ridiculous and colossal number. The hope at the time was to make the cost or estimates of the cost of purchasing equipment more realistic, more transparent, and more accountable. Let me give you an idea of how this works. 2 years ago, the federal government finally signed a contract after many fits and starts to agree to buy 80 new strike fighter jets, the F-35, from Lockheed Martin. The price expressed in the contract was $19 billion, or about $220 million per plane. A few months later, the Parliamentary Budget Office announced that the true cost, in their view, of the F-35 program was much higher than that the federal government, in signing the contract, was somehow hiding a bunch of expenses. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office report, the true cost of the F-35 program was, forget $19 billion altogether, more like $74 billion or $840 million per plane. The difference, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, was their estimate of what it's going to cost to operate, sustain, and then dispose of the aircraft over the next 35 years. The move to full life cycle costing directly impacts Canada's defense capabilities. It shapes public perception of the value of government spending on military purchases, and it directly shapes the way that we prepare for future conflicts. Despite the high hopes for life cycle costing for more realistic, transparent, and accountable buying, tonight I want to argue that life cycle costing has been a disaster. It's nonsense, it makes us stupid, and it helps our enemies. And it's not just about the F-35. CBC recently reported just a few weeks ago that the lifetime cost of owning and operating the new maritime helicopters that will fly off the back of our new Navy ships, the Cyclone, had risen by $1 billion to $15.9 billion. Somehow they came up with this number before the last of the Cyclone helicopters had even been delivered. I don't know how you decide the lifetime cost of a program that hasn't delivered the last of the helicopters to the Air Force yet. Defense Minister Bill Blair was forced to go out in public to respond to the Parliamentary Budget Office's updated costing to express his concerns about how the costs had risen out of control. Canada may soon be building new combat ships for the Navy. I mean, if they don't get started on it soon, they won't have a Navy. The so-called river-class ships. The design of these 15 ships has not yet been finalized. We don't really know exactly what's going to be on board these ships. We don't quite know exactly how big they're going to be. We don't know who's going to supply all of the parts that will go into the ship. But the Parliamentary Budget Office and others are already estimating their life cycle cost will exceed $75 billion. Those numbers are being used right now. I was in Ottawa on Monday for a defense procurement conference. I can tell you they're being used on Monday to press the government to cancel the river-class project altogether in favor of buying some other type of ship from some other country using some other shipyard. How much does life cycle costing for a military purchase really tell us? After 10 years of playing around with these numbers, I think it's time for a rethink. After all, as Rob says, no one uses life cycle costing in making decisions about their personal lives. If you're thinking of buying a new car, as Rob says, you can shop around. You can plainly see the upfront cost or the capital cost of the car. It's on the sticker, or at least it's on the purchase price that you negotiate with the sales manager at the dealership. It might be $40,000, $50,000. And if you do some extra research, you might have a general idea of how much gas economy, fuel economy the car has. How relatively expensive is it going to be to run the car back and forth to work every day, to run it around Calgary while you drop the kids off at activities, if you have to go to Banff and back again, how much a tank of gas is going to cost you to do that. If you do a bit more research, you might have a general idea of whether the model of car that you're buying breaks down more frequently than some other model of car. Is it particularly expensive to get it repaired? How much are the tires going to cost when you need to replace the tires? I bet you also, but I bet one thing you never do is add up all of the cost of the gas that you're going to use, whether you keep it or whether you sell it after a few years, the full cost of the gas it's going to have until it's no longer able to run. I bet you don't add up all of the costs of the repairs and maintenance it's going to need over its total life, whether you own it or not. I bet you do not add in the cost of insuring it until it's disposed of, whether you're the one driving it or somebody with a higher risk premium is driving it. I bet you don't include the cost of driver's education for your kids or for anyone else that might end up driving it over the next 20 or 30 years. And I suspect that you don't calculate the cost of disposing of the car at the end of its life. Maybe you should assume you're making a mistake. Maybe you should assume that the next owner of the car will want to repaint it or upgrade the tires to a beefier set of tires, replace the stereo with a better sound system. The lifetime cost of that $40,000 car is probably, let's pick a number, $200,000, $300,000. How much of a stereo will the next owner of the car want to put in? Is that a $500,000 car? It depends on your assumptions. These are meaningless numbers after a certain point. Is that a more realistic number? A more transparent number? How are you supposed to know how many kilometers the car will be driven 18 years from now, when it might be owned by a different person? Why would you consider the paint job or the stereo that you won't even have a role in deciding whether to purchase? But these are precisely the kinds of decisions that have to be made when you're doing life cycle costing of a big capital purchase. Life cycle costing has several flaws that make it a terrible tool, particularly for evaluating military spending. First of all, as I said, life cycle costing is total nonsense. Pretending you could figure out the total cost of a new military airplane over the next 35 years means depending on assumptions. Life cycle costing relies on models and projections of future costs, and these projections are, to say the least, inherently uncertain. For example, how long will the planes remain in service? 20 years? 40 years? How long will they be useful in international context? When the Parliamentary Budget Office first got into calculating the life cycle cost of the F-35 purchase, when the Harper government was thinking of buying the plane, at the midway point after the first set of estimates had been released, the Parliamentary Budget Office decided that it would just extend its estimate of the lifetime of the F-35 from 30 years to 40 years, adding another 10 years worth of expenses to the total cost of the plane. And the Parliamentary Budget Office said if we're going to have the plane for that long, not only will the engines have to be replaced once, but they'll be replaced twice. So we better add in the cost of 3 sets of engines for every plane, the original one plus the 2 replacement engines. The radar will need to be replaced every 10 years, 8 years, 5 years. Pick the biggest one. Add up the biggest possible number. We need to scare the little children. How many flight hours will an F-35 accumulate each year? How much will the fuel cost for a jet engine be in the year 2030? What about the year 2040? And what kind of future technologies will the future governments that keep this plane for as long as the Parliamentary Budget Office assumes, what technology upgrades will be available? Which ones will they decide upon? How much are those going to cost? The Parliamentary Budget Office's costing of the F-35 pretends you could look ahead 35 years and know the answer to all of these questions with something like a helpful degree of accuracy, and then know the cost of disposing of the planes sometime in the 2060s. According to the most recent estimates of the Parliamentary Budget Office, they're assuming that 88 planes can be disposed of for $200 million in the year 2063, or something like that. But we cannot know the answers to these questions. They depend on events we can't predict. How many wars will we fight in the next 35 years? Rob, got an estimate? 2 or 3? It'll make a big difference in the cost of the planes. Well, then add more. Will simulator technology increase the number of training hours these planes need to be flown each year? Or will they reduce them? And if so, by how much? Even small changes in these assumptions can produce dramatically different life cycle cost estimates, undermining their reliability. Then, if you read the fine point of the most recent life cycle cost estimate for the F-35, go right down into the footnotes, you'll find out that the Parliamentary Budget Office inflates the cost of the next 35 years of the aircraft by what it thinks the consumer price index will be each year for the next 35 years. Yeah, when the Parliamentary Budget Office tells you that each F-35 is going to cost $840 million to buy and operate, that's not in 2024 dollars. That's in inflated dollars over the next 35 years. And my degree of confidence in PBO's estimate of what the consumer price index is going to be for the next 35 years is precisely 0. So the farther into the future these estimates go, the more nonsensical they become. And then let me add, life cycle costing is one-sided. It's based on imaginary future costs, but ignores the potential offsetting benefits of having a well-equipped military force. After all, the purpose of having strike fighters and maritime helicopters and combat ships is primarily to deter conflict. Equip your force too lightly, and conflict is more likely. So how many wars are deterred if we buy the F-35? Isn't that an offsetting benefit of the purchase? How much money are we saving because of the wars that they deter? If the F-35 or the Cyclone helicopter or the River-class ships prevent a war with China or protect our critical sea lanes in the event of war, how do we quantify those savings? They must be in the trillions of dollars. We can only imagine what the cost of a single war with China would be. How much is the war in Ukraine costing that could have been deterred with a better equipped armed forces? We can barely calculate the total. So instead of saying that the F-35 will cost us $74 billion over 34 years, an imaginary number, maybe the purchase saves us $1 trillion. Maybe instead of being a net cost to the country, the purchase is a net benefit to the country. Maybe it's $2 trillion. Would we save more if we bought more strike fighters or more combat ships? Possibly. In a sense, I'm making silly arguments here. I mean, I realize these are silly questions. No one knows how many wars a single F-35 will deter. How many will be deterred if we buy 88 of them versus 98 of them versus 120 of them? Who knows? There's no way to calculate that. But the asymmetry of calculating only the costs and not the benefits of having a military force skews public perception of defense spending, making it seem disproportionately expensive. So let me say, my first point, life cycle costing of defense purchases is total nonsense. But it also makes us stupid. It removes information from the public realm and obscures accountability. What do I mean by this? By rolling the upfront capital cost, the purchase cost of an airplane, and all of the imaginary operating costs of that airplane for the next 35 years into a single number, a single costing, you're taking information away from the public, not adding. You might estimate that the F-35 will cost a lot more than $75 billion if you separated out the upfront purchase price and a reasonable estimate of the annual operating costs. But even so, estimating the 35-year cost of a military purchase and rolling it into a single number obscures who's really responsible for all the decisions about how a piece of equipment will be used. For example, think about the Air Force's maritime helicopter program, the Cyclone purchase. The Martin government ordered the helicopters in 2004 and signed the original contract. The Harper government, while I was there, handled parts of the procurement, including the settlement of a major legal dispute with Sikorsky, the manufacturer of the helicopter, about whether they were delivered in good operating condition or not. The Trudeau government is making decisions about the operation and maintenance of that fleet today, even though we have yet to take delivery of the last of the helicopters. And other governments in the future will make decisions about the operation, maintenance, and disposal of those helicopters at some point well into the future. It's the same with every major military purchase. The stuff that we buy today is not going to be used by the government today. It's going to be used by some government in the future that will make its own decisions. It's the same for the F-35. It's the same for the River-class Navy ships. It's the same for every other piece of military equipment that Canada buys. But the life cycle cost estimates hold one government responsible for decisions that won't be made for years to come. When will we upgrade the Cyclone helicopters? That's a decision for a future government. Will we extend their life beyond 30 years? A decision for a future government. It undermines the principle of responsible government, where accountability should lie with those who make the decisions. In other words, life cycle costing makes us stupid. But finally, I want to argue that life cycle costing also helps our enemies. Why is this? Because life cycle costing inflates the cost of defense purchases versus other activities the federal government might undertake. Have you ever noticed that it's only military equipment that gets inflated by these projections of life cycle costs? The NDP Liberal Coalition Agreement, which fell apart earlier this year, committed the federal government to starting a dental care program. That dental care program started in 2022. It was a $650 payment to low-income families. The original estimate was the first year of the program would cost $1.7 billion. Last year's budget set aside $13 billion over 5 years for an extension of the program, and then said that the program would cost $4.4 billion the year after that. That's the annual cost of the program in 2029. But let's take a parliamentary budget office approach to the total life cycle cost of the dental care program. No one ever asks what the life cycle cost of the dental program is, but if we're going to compare apples to apples, let's build ourselves an apple and compare it. Let's do a life cycle cost of the dental program. And let's assume over time, just because we've got an Excel spreadsheet to fill, that the eligible population that's going to receive benefits under the dental care program increases every year. I mean, at the rate that we have people coming to the country, it's going to go up quickly. And let's assume that every 5 years or so, a future government will make it easier to qualify for dental program benefits. Then let's add in inflation and the cost of providing dental services, and the cost of training new dentists, and the cost of training new dental hygienists. That's not $4.4 billion. That's 1 year's estimate of just the direct cost. Let's add in everything. Let's run it out for 35 years. Let's inflate it. Let's expand it. Let's assume there's new dental technologies every 5 years that we have to pay for. It's not a $4.4 billion program. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I can play around with the estimates however I please. I could make it cost $1 trillion over 35 years if I wanted to. Way more than the cost of the F-35 project, or the River-class ships project, or the helicopters, or all of them together. Whatever the cost of the dental program is on a life cycle basis, it is a very, very large number. But if all we do is inflate the cost of military equipment, and only of defense equipment, life cycle costing misleads us into spending on everything except defending ourselves and our allies. By focusing the public debate on artificially inflated costs rather than strategic needs, life cycle costing risks undermining public support for defense spending at all. Life cycle costing helps our enemies by keeping us weak. So how do we get around this problem? How do we get around the damage that the Parliamentary Budget Office and the Auditor General have done to our way of thinking through the costs of equipping ourselves for the future? How can we talk about military procurement in the years to come? Let me offer a few suggestions. First of all, we should take the challenge of producing costs more seriously. We should report the costs separately. Governments could provide both the capital upfront cost for purchasing equipment and a range of cost estimates for running that equipment over the course of a reasonably foreseeable period. 5 years, not 35 years, 2 years maybe. Emphasize that the future cost beyond that will depend on future decisions of future governments. Secondly, I think we need to challenge the life cycle paradigm of the Parliamentary Budget Office. Policymakers should push back, always repeating over and over again that life cycle costs of any project are inherently speculative. We have to do a better job of rolling the communication of benefits into this. Highlight the strategic value of having properly equipped military forces. Explain how they protect trade routes, contribute to NATO missions, and most importantly, deter adversaries. These aren't costs. These are ways of preventing bigger costs in the future. And finally, we have to remind everyone that Canada's future depends on choices we make in future elections over to who to hand the keys of power to, not spreadsheets full of guesses and estimates today. Life cycle costing has reshaped how we think about defense spending to our detriment. While it aims to provide transparency, it can obscure the real costs and benefits of critical military investments. Buying military equipment has a value. That value goes way beyond the price tag for the purchase and for some estimate of the lifetime cost of operating and maintaining it. Strike fighters, helicopters, combat ships, all the other stuff we're going to need in the future. If they're vital parts of Canada's defense strategy, then let's explain them that way. They ensure our armed forces remain capable of protecting Canada, our people, and our allies in an uncertain world. As citizens, I agree, we should demand accountability and clarity from our government, but we should also recognize that no accounting method can replace sound strategic judgment about the country's future. Canada's security and our role on the global stage depends on it. Rob, I'm happy to take whatever questions people have.
Thank you very much. You did not definitely disappoint. We now will open up for questions. Dr. Stapleton.
When did this start and why did we start doing it? You'll recall that during the Chrétien government, the American allies started to think through how to replace the combat planes that we had. And that was the original genesis of the Joint Strike Fighter project, which became the F-35. The decision was that all of the military services would buy a single plane in the United States, and then the Americans would bring allies into the cost of developing the project. Canada agreed to participate, throw some money into the pot to help develop the project, in exchange for which we would get the contract to build the landing gear. However, whoever bought the plane, they'd have to buy the landing gear from us. The plane was developed and turned out at the time it was going to estimate to cost $80 million apiece. So the Harper government went ahead with negotiations with Lockheed Martin, chosen to produce the plane, to replace the Air Force combat planes that we have. At the time, the Air Force's estimate was that we would need 66 of these planes to cover all of the responsibilities that Canada had for its defense. And the total cost of that project was somewhere in the $9 billion range. At that point, Tim, I have to tell you, I'm not sure exactly what happened. That is the first time that we did that for a project of this size. There were estimates of the life cycle cost of particular projects for not life cycle. What's the cost going to be up front? And then what's the annual operating cost going to be for the first couple of years of the project? I mean, I think that's a reasonable set of calculations to do. But it was the F-35, the effort to drive the total cost from $7, $8, $9 billion into the 50, 60, 80, $90 billion range that got us into this kind of trouble. In part, this is my fault. I put into the 2006 Conservative platform that we'd have a parliamentary budget office. I helped pick the original parliamentary budget officer. He was looking at that time to make a name for himself and to put his office on the map. And he decided of all the things that he wanted to do, little did I know, he was just inherently opposed to a Canadian defense policy that involved defending Canada against threats. And so he cottoned on to the F-35 purchase. As I said, kept coming up with all these increasingly fantastical scenarios about how much the thing would cost. I think if he was still the parliamentary budget officer today, we'd be in the $100 billion, $200 billion range. But once he'd put out the idea that the government had no handle on how much the planes were going to cost, and of course there was a media pile-on and then an opposition party pile-on, politics takes over at this point. I get that. I was in the business. It became impossible to roll it back. And now everything has to be costed the same way with the same ridiculous set of Excel spreadsheets. And I'm trying to figure out a way we can get out of this, because we can't go on like this, deluding ourselves with imaginary costs of what these projects are going to be.
Sir.
Yes, Doctor, could not the media, responsible media, help get us out of this conundrum? I'm thinking of someone like Oprah Winfrey asking some official, what is the price tag like in a car lot on this airplane? And then what would be your yearly operating costs? Could they not make a shift like that that could affect then political thinking?
Yeah, so I should say this speech today is the beginning of my effort to try to go around to the reporters that cover this sort of stuff to persuade them to stop falling for this nonsense. It's nonsense, it makes us stupid, it helps our enemies. I have to say that part of the problem is the only reporter who really covers this regularly is Murray Brewster at CBC, David Pugliese at the Post Media chain. And otherwise, most of the reporters who cover this stuff are assigned to cover it for the day that the report comes out. And then the next day they're covering cat cut up a tree or debate in the House of Commons, tomorrow's question period topic. So it's difficult. We don't really have defense reporters anymore in the country who report on this stuff from day to day. So I'm going to have to speak to people 50 at a time at every military museum in the country until we get it through our head.
Sir,
Yeah, I don't need a microphone.
well, it's just so that we have your voice on the.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is it this kind of costing done in other countries?
Short answer is no. The Americans have a variety of ways of estimating the cost of their military purchases. But when the former head of the U.S. Air Force was given this idea that they should do a total life cycle cost estimate of the purchase of their F-35s, he says, what would be the purpose of that? Just to scare the little children, recognizing that this is a completely nonsensical number. So no, I think we're unique in talking ourselves into the idea that these purchases cost a lot more than they really do. And insofar as people do project purchases into the future, which I don't think it's completely unreasonable, nobody adds in the cost of inflation, so you're not spending $20, $24. Nobody does this in a way so that you're projecting what the cost is in $2063, which won't be worth as much as a dollar is today. So of course the number will look huge.
Sir, over here. Please identify yourself if you may.
My name's Pat Ryan. So my question is, does the analysis change if you look at the alternative options to the F-35 and the existing aeroplanes used today and their full cost analysis? So if everything is done in full cost analysis, does it help you or hinder or whatever?
Well, the problem is that because we have only relatively recently invented the idea of life cycle cost analysis, we don't have any historical comparisons. So when the Harbour government was trying to cope with the original life cycle cost estimate of the F-35, there was a request put out to the Air Force, could you calculate the total life cycle cost of the F-18 that we bought in whatever that was, 1982? Now the plane's been around for 40 years. How much does it cost over the total life of that plane? And the answer came back 2 weeks later, can't compute. We never kept track. How much was the total cost of fueling that plane over the course of 40 years? It went to the Gulf War, it went on exercises, it flew in the Balkans. Nobody thought to go through and add up the total life cycle cost because why would you bother? We made the decisions about how to use the plane on a year-by-year, decision-by-decision basis. So unfortunately, the answer is we don't really have much in the way of a comparison here. And because other countries don't project the cost of their planes on the same basis, it's hard to tell, is the F-35 more expensive than the alternatives? I think once you play around with the numbers in the spreadsheet, you could make them whatever you wanted.
Thanks, Colonel Hunt. My question's around the legislative framework around the parliamentary budget officer.
Right.
Or budget office. And like in theory, couldn't Parliament or certainly a government that had a majority pass legislation that provided legal guidance as to how it would perform those functions, much like regulatory agencies are responsible for compliance with legislation that governs them?
I think that's a great question. I have given a bit of thought to this. Well, I think you could direct the Parliamentary Budget Office to calculate these things on a different basis, but I don't think that would stop them from replicating these numbers. And in a certain sense, I think that's short-circuiting the process. I think what we do need is to actually have a more fulsome debate here with them to persuade them that they're doing a terrible job of informing people about how much these things cost. I mean, to assume for a moment that they want to do a good job of telling us what these purchases are going to cost, to just point out they're nonsense. They make us stupid and they help our enemies. And I hope if I keep repeating that over and over again, maybe they'll call me one day and we'll have a discussion about it.
So, just on that note, ultimately it's responsible to Parliament, right? So if
That's right.
it's about maintaining the confidence of Parliament in its work,
That's right.
that that's why I loop back to legislation, and I've certainly seen examples at a provincial level where you have agencies that have lost the confidence of government, and frankly, the boards get replaced.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to do something to get this debate back onto a more reasonable track. Starting with a 5-year estimate might be, something that's reasonably foreseeable. I don't know what the price of airline fuel or aviation fuel is going to be 5 years from now, but I'm more confident that we'd be close to it than the price in 2063.
My name is Bill Hosey. My question changes the subject just a little bit. I didn't listen to the news this afternoon, so I'm sure Pierre and the premiers have decided to meet the 2% military commitment within as soon as possible, and recognizing that next year it'll be 3%. Could you tell us how long it'll take to make the 2% and the 3% and what your strategy would be?
My experience in this is once the Prime Minister of the country communicates to his civil service and uniformed advisors that he wants something done by a certain date, or else all hell's going to break loose, things happen. So I think if you leave the system on autopilot, nothing is ever accomplished in Ottawa. I hate to put it that way. It sounds cynical. I don't mean that. I mean, like, the process of political accountability is actually how the things get done in Ottawa, or how things get done in the federal government. So I think we can invent many complicated ways that 2% might get delayed till 2032 or 2045 or 2050. I actually think if the Prime Minister pulled people in tomorrow morning and said, we're going to have to do a credible job of defending ourselves and contributing to the defense of allies, and we're going to have to do it quickly, I don't think the problem is, there's limits. You can't just conjure a ship out of nothing. You can't just force Lockheed Martin to deliver planes faster than they can be produced. But I think within that context, let me put it this way. I gather that we and the Allies have run out of shells and bullets. There's a serious shortage. The former Chief of Defense Staff said a critical shortage of expendable ammunition. I learned when I was in government that all of the plants that Canada has to produce that stuff are in Quebec. And all of the stuff that you need to produce those shells and those bullets are minerals that we produce in Canada. One thing Canadian governments have become very adept at doing over the course of the past 100 years is seeing that money is spent in Quebec. I don't want to draw too blunt a comparison here, but I've got to believe that in a certain sense, if the Prime Minister decided that we need to build out armaments plants in Quebec and keep Canadian mines going to produce the minerals to make that stuff, we could get to 2% or 3% or whatever percent was required.
First in the gray, and then in the
My name is Sean Ryan. When it comes to the $220 million or so that you mentioned as the unit price for an F-35, before any parliamentary budget office estimates, are these peacetime costs, or would we be expecting to pay the same costs in a conflict situation where we're presumably losing this equipment much more frequently and then having to replace it?
Well, I think there is a legitimate question about, if I understand the parameters of the contract, and it's not my specialty, but if I understand the parameters of the contract, the $220 million includes the cost of basically flying the plane into a Canadian air base, and then some of the associated costs of the original replacement parts and so forth, some of the training to get our technicians up to speed on how to fix their engines versus the ones that we have. And of course, there's some costs that will be required to accommodate hangars that we use. They may not be quite the right size, or some of the other equipment we use for maintenance will be in addition to that. But no, I think from what I understand, that is the contracted cost of the plane for the duration of the delivery portion of the contract. And then there'll be a separate contract, has been led, I gather, to a firm for the maintenance of those planes over time.
Thanks for your time. My name is Mike Fluke. My question's around what else is wrong with procurement. The track record of Canadian procurement since the 80s is really bad through both parties across the board, basically. And the life cycle costing is relatively new. So what else is going wrong, and what's stopping equipment from actually getting deployed and operationalized?
I want to put a fence around that for just a minute, because when I was in Mr. Harper's office, the Air Force had a need for the big intercontinental transport planes, the C-17. If I remember correctly, those were authorized for purchase in the spring of 2006, and they were delivered. The first one of them was delivered in the middle of 2007, and they were all delivered, if I remember correctly, by the end of 2009. They showed up. They cost what the contract said they were going to cost. They were delivered on the schedule that basically were supposed to be delivered on. And we bought helicopters for use in Afghanistan, tanks from Germany or Netherlands or wherever it's from. They were delivered on the timeline that was projected. And then the sort of the medium-sized transport planes, those big Hercules planes that get used every day, there was a contract let for those, and they were delivered pretty much on time and pretty much on budget. So there are occasions where over the last 20 years we've been able to do this successfully. Those are not complicated programs. I get that. Those are not trying to invent a new class of combat ship to keep up with the latest trends in combat ship needs. I understand that. But I would say what was different was the minister who wanted all that stuff on time was my boss, the Prime Minister. He insisted that the stuff had to be delivered. He had a defense minister who was willing to be decisive about it, and a procurement minister who was not scared by numbers in the billions of dollars. And I think we may have lost some of that focus over time. The projects or the process of buying the stuff can be as complicated as you want it to be. And in the absence of a minister saying, when is this stuff going to be delivered? When are we going to close the design phase of the ship? Can we close it this month? If we can't close it this month, can we close it next month? The process will go on forever and the cost will escalate. Yeah, for sure. I mean, in that case, the decision was that we had to build the shipyard before we could build the ships. And there's now talk of buying submarines. If we take the same approach, first we must build a submarine construction yard. Those ships will come sometime after the year, or those submarines will come sometime after the year 2100, I'm sure.
And just on the programs where there was political will of a complex program was the modernization of the Halifax-class frigates. The Flex program not only came under budget, it was actually delivered early. So they were ahead of schedule. So again, matching what Dr. Brodie is saying, with political will, you can achieve that. And that was a very complex program. Other questions? Sir?
Colonel Kyle Clapperton. I'll pile on the kind of topic of political will. You've talked about when there is political will, things can happen and rapidly. When there's not political will, it could take dozens of years to get to 2%. And I'll preface that comment with thanking everybody for coming out, because I don't think that there's national discourse on national security in the military in Canada, and that's a failing of Canadians. So an informed populace, people that come out to talks like this, are actually like, that helps, and we should be doing more of this. And so kudos to everybody that came out to this lecture. We need more Canadians more involved, because one of the levers to push political will is the interests and needs of the populace. And so my question then maybe is, lacking a engaged media, lacking large public discourse on national defense, how can we move the needle on that to make national security defense procurement something that's of a concern to Canadians and therefore concern to our elected officials, and therefore something that when national security actually becomes a topic in our elections, et cetera?
I think that's a great question. Look, I think on this case, I'm optimistic that things are changing. I think the polling companies are trying to figure out a way of measuring the shift in public opinion, and I don't think we've quite settled on a good measure of that yet. But I would say that over the last 2 years, 2 and a bit years, we have something like 1 million Canadians who trace their ancestry to Ukraine. And if you throw in Poland and Hungary and Romania and Moldova and the other countries in the area that are obviously worried about what after Ukraine, you're adding up to a good chunk of Canadians who have some kind of family attachment to a very immediate security situation in Europe. We have the biggest land war in Europe since 1945. That has repercussions for Canadians, not just in the sense of, it may disrupt travel plans or it may disrupt trade, but there's people with family ties. If we add in all the Canadians whose family roots are in Taiwan or in Philippines or in Malaysia, where there's other pressures, Vietnam, which fought a land war with China not that long ago, you're adding up to millions of Canadians who have some sense that the world is not as safe as it might appear to be if you're standing out on Crowchild Trail at Flanders Road. That we're in a uniquely privileged position here, but that the world security situation is turning darker. And my sense is that that's, from what I gather from talking to the polling companies, this is starting to show up, but they're trying to figure out quite how to measure it, how to get a handle on how it's shifting over time. Add in the situation in the Middle East or people who are worried about supply chains through the Red Sea and so forth. I think we might underestimate, because we don't really have a very good way of measuring it, how much Canadian public opinion has shifted on this, how much people are aware, maybe not of the precise worries about over-the-horizon radar in the Arctic or whatever, but they have a general sense that the situation globally has turned more dangerous. And I think the political debate is struggling to catch up with that sense of foreboding about the situation around us. I say that before the political situation changed in the United States. Actually, that's a lagging indicator rather than a leading one.
My name is Rahim. So I was just wondering, the decision to go for the life cycle costing, was it based on the fact that there was some money somewhere that they could spend, so they had that liberty so they took it to that extent, or it was based on the fact that the economy could absorb this new system they decided to go in for?
No, I think it was, I think that's a good question. I think it was a decision inside the Parliamentary Budget Office to inflate the apparent cost of these projects. I mean, in that sense, I think it was a political decision to shift from more informative and more realistic ways of pricing these or estimating the cost of these projects to a less realistic, but in a certain sense, more intimidating number. Because otherwise, why wouldn't we price everything the way that we price military projects on a life cycle basis? If we did that, the relative cost and benefits might become apparent, but we only do it for one set of projects.
John Ferris. You were there at the time that all of this happened, and it seemed to me from the outside that both Paul Martin and Stephen Harper, to give both of them their credit, were unusually willing to spend money in order to help Canadian forces, but into difficult circumstances. Precisely how far can you say that the business you're discussing actually affected Stephen Harper's willingness to try to pursue more defense expenditures? And I appreciate that there are a number of problems involved in your answer.
Well, let me talk about the F-35 project specifically, because I think the the sequence of events is basically on the record, is that as the parliamentary budget officer and then the auditor general started going through these concerns about how do we get a handle on life cycle costs, that's when the Harbour government put the pause button on the F-35. And rather than just saying, look, this is the plane that we need 66 or however many of them, at the time it was 66, and we're going to go ahead with them because they're necessary and important, there was this sort of, we have to push pause until we can figure out ourselves what the life cycle cost is so we can respond to the parliamentary budget officer. At that point, as the enemy of all governments, you run out of time, and eventually you're defeated. And at that point, then the new government decided to cancel the project and go on this search for other alternatives, only to come back. I mean, in effect, we lost, let's call it a decade in the purchase. If we'd gone ahead, we'd have the planes, or we'd be beginning to get the planes today, and they'd be up flying as they are for several other of our allies around the world. As it is, we sort of sent the message to Lockheed Martin that they can push us down in the priority list. So, look, I don't want to pretend that the political management of this at the time was anything other than reactive and day to day, but it did impose, I think, the very real cost of delaying this to the point where the Harbour government was out of office and then the project was closed out altogether.
Hi, my name's Terry Holland. If you went to the University of Calgary School of Business, I bet they would say that it's not life cycle costing that they're doing. I'm reaching back into my memory a bit, but the Purchasing Management Association of Canada, I think, has a definition of life cycle costing. Certainly as a marketer and a manufacturer, we used it to explain competitive advantage, comparison products, those sorts of things within a limited, you used the word fences. There were fences around the evaluation so a comparative study could be done. Have you considered of simply saying it's not life cycle costing? It's absolutely not what, that is actually a valuable tool used in business. This is a misapplication, and they shouldn't be allowed to call it that. Is that a logical approach of saying that this is not a real thing, the way you're using it?
No, I did some work last year trying to dig into what a business, sort of a business side life cycle costing of a project like this would be. And I think you're right on this, is that in the private sector calculations, a good cost accountant will apply life cycle cost accounting to a relatively less complicated set of variables for a relatively more discrete set of decisions, if I could be very technical about it. And therefore, in a sort of a 5-year life cycle cost for a new piece of equipment, maybe that's a more reasonable set of calculations. You can have an idea of what the upfront capital is and what the annual running costs are with some reasonable assumptions. But that's for like a piece of plant equipment that you're pretty sure you're going to run for 35 hours a week or 42 hours a week, and you can pretty accurately determine what the maintenance contract for that's going to be on an annual basis, sometimes because the supplier produces, gets the maintenance contract. You say, well, this is what it's going to cost us over 5 years. Those are, I don't want to over-exaggerate here, but those are relatively simpler case studies or use cases than trying to estimate the life cycle cost of an extremely complex, Boeing will not give you the life cycle cost of a 787 because it's up to you. Depends on how you're going to use it. Depends on who you hire to service it. Depends on what kind of routes you fly with it. Boeing's not going to give you the life cycle cost of one of their planes because in a certain sense, all the crucial decisions are yours. And those are relatively simple, even those are relatively simple compared to trying to calculate what's the life cycle cost of a Navy ship, that we don't even know what the technology is going to be yet. So I think it's a fair criticism to say, in addition to what I've said here, the Parliamentary Budget Office has really stretched the concept of life cycle costing well past the normal breaking point for this kind of exercise.
It sounds, Barry Cooper, it sounds as if the
Parliamentary Budget Office decided to do this on their own. Can the Prime Minister say, stop, don't do it the way you want to do it? Or are they sufficiently independent that they can do whatever the heck they want?
Well, they are in that sense sufficiently independent that they report to no one. They certainly don't report to the Prime Minister. They report in theory to Parliament, but with 338 MPs, and they obviously have other calculations to make in what instructions they give. I think the Parliamentary Budget Office is basically on its own, and so they can make up the rules as they want. Absent some kind of, as we said earlier, some kind of legislative direction passed through Parliament to say, stop doing it this way and please do it another way. I think they're going to keep on doing it this way until we persuade them that it's not helping, it's hurting.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to follow up again on the life cycle costing about things like airplanes and things like that. Boeing doesn't give you a life cycle costing, but if you're an airline buying it, you certainly make your own, right? And I think just following up on that, the question, it's a useful planning tool. There's definitely too many assumptions, like you're saying, for sure. And the question is, where's its proper place in that planning procedure cycle, as opposed to being that one critical factor? How do we kind of get that information out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, having worked at the top of government, the crucial variable here is who's in charge of the government, which will depend on elections in the future. In a certain sense, there's nothing written in stone that says the F-35 will cost $74.9 billion over the next 35 years, in part because we and our fellow citizens will elect future governments that will make decisions. If we don't like what they decide, we'll replace them with somebody else. And so in a certain sense here, we're trying to take what is effectively a political matter, I mean a political matter in the good sense of the term, like it's up to us collectively to make some decisions through our political process about how we want to use these planes, and try to turn them into like a technical economics exercise. And when it comes particularly to national defense issues, national security issues, these are in some ways the ultimate political decisions. They're the least susceptible of a technical economics or accounting exercise of any of the decisions the government takes. So I guess in that sense as well, we're trying to take what is originally sort of a technocratic economics exercise and apply it to the least technocratic economics-driven part of the government. And so inevitably there was going to be a mismatch here. The people who came up with this idea in the first place, let's do a life cycle cost analysis of the F-35, if they had reflected on the limits of their own technocratic economics education, we would never have gone down this path in the first place. If I can boast about political science for a minute.
Any other questions? Dr. Brodie has, there is one here.
Hey, my name is Manpreet. I think, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of scaring the children going on. I do believe that the F-35 program is great for our country, and beyond that, I feel like we've scared the children to a point where they're scared of the cost of it, but to me, is it a question of can we afford not to have this kind of development? Aerial combat has evolved so much, and it continues to evolve. Why would we not want this in our arsenal, especially when our opponents are essentially investing that same kind of money, and we don't know if we can always rely on our own allies. So to me, is it a question of can we afford not to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I had to find one silver lining in this cloud, is that we've now had two governments of two different political stripes go through the exercise of trying to figure out what plane we should get, or three different governments if we go back to Kretjen making the original decision to buy into the consortium. Three different governments of two different political stripes. Surely we are as close to a bipartisan consensus that this is the right plane as we could possibly be, absent Jagmeet Singh becoming the next Prime Minister and starting the exercise all over again.
Any other last question? Dr. Brodie has generously agreed to stick around informally if you want to come and talk.
Always better over beer.
Always. 2 points, of course, just before I thank him. We can think in terms of some of the knowledge that he's provided us with. The debate, of course, of dental care is always situated on how much it costs if we don't do it. How much will it cost for the children that are not receiving the dental care? So again, we can see the political nature of this, that we will do it on that set of arguments, but we don't do it on defense. And I think one of the other things I reflect upon is that the efforts of both the Public Budget Office as well as the main media, David Puglisi, who reports on it, is that the numbers never deal with what statistics are known. We have never kept any of our fleets that we have purchased without loss. The CF-105s, we lost about 50% of the total aircraft by the time they reached their end of their lifespan. We now probably have about, out of the 133 F-18s that we bought, we probably have about 50, 55 that are still operating. So again, even pretending that we can figure out what the gas is going to cost, those aren't being brought into the actual calculation. So it's, you know, if it was a student of mine giving me that methodology, I would be forced to fail them because, of course, it misses that element. I think we've been privileged to hear a very critically important issue explained to us in terms that I think that more of us have to get out and try to be pressing about the absurdity of what this is actually meaning and how much this is hurting us in terms of, as you know, Dr. Brodie may joke about the number of wars coming, but I think that we can all agree we need the insurance right now to try to put the deterrence as much as possible. So Dr. Brodie, thank you on behalf of CMSS. Thank you very much. I invite everybody now to come back and enjoy. We still have some food. The bar will remain open. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on January with Dr. Hebert.